What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, Frank Turek is going to be talking about slavery in the Bible and how it doesn't exist. Obviously, he is going to tell us that we're just not reading the text correctly, and that you got to read it in this specific light, in this specific apologetic context, in order to make chattel slavery be indentured servitude. But he does put a new spin on this topic by comparing it to abortion. So if you want to fuck around and find out how Frank Turek connects slavery to abortion, then please stay tuned.
There's a big difference between the slavery in Old Testament and the slavery for the black people.
Yes.
Because the slavery in the Old Testament was mostly like an employee that is not paid but is protected, is nourished, and they could not be beaten or whatever.
There is a difference for sure, but there's not a big difference between the two. The Old Testament does have indentured servitude as one of the types of slavery that was practiced by Israel. But it also includes chattel slavery, which was the type of slavery employed by the Atlantic slave trade. So really, this is just a distinction without a real difference. One was owning people as property, and the other one was owning people as property, just a little less bad. Now, it's true that you couldn't own your fellow Israelite in the same way that you could own foreigners, most of the time. But being an indentured servant at this time was not simply like having an employee. Whoever told this person that was clearly lying to them, because the only way that you can paint the indentured servitude practiced by the Israelite society as just simply having an employee is to lie about what's in the Bible.
But there's one passage in Leviticus 25. I'm not going to use the KJV because as a Frenchman,
okay,
it's a bit hard. So I'm getting,
go ahead, Robert.
The CSB, okay.
What does it say?
So it says you may also purchase them from the aliens, so neighboring countries, residing with you or with the family living among you, those born in your land. They may become your property. You may leave them to your son and whatever. But it say also, but if it's someone from your, like an Israelite, you cannot beat them up or something like that. It makes almost like the same thing as the black who were beaten up, and it says, don't do it to Israelite. It make almost say that you can do it for aliens. How do you reconcile that?
This isn't exactly what Leviticus 25, 44 through 46 says. Here's what it literally says. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. This is a clear message that God supports and condones slavery, like chattel slavery. You know, that thing that the Atlantic slave traders practiced. It's really hard to argue that God didn't support and condone chattel slavery, not only because of this passage, but also because the Israelite society operated similarly to other ancient Near East societies. Claiming that Israel didn't practice chattel slavery is specially pleading for God to be better than he actually was in the Old Testament. The fact is that the Israelites did practice chattel slavery amongst other forms of slavery. But there are certain situations in which an indentured servant could become a slave for life or a chattel slave. Now I'm telling you, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, The wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, whichever one works for you better. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl. Not like a hoo-hoo owl, but, like a little wood thingy. And he shall be his slave forever. Exodus 21:4. God is great, isn't he? God is good all the time and all the time.
God is good.
Thank you, hon. I know you're here to help, babe. Thank you. There were also situations in which you were forced into indentured servitude. Not because you owed money or anything, but because somebody else did, and they had the ability to sell you into this indentured servitude as a way for them to pay for their debt. Now listen, okay? The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. And Elisha didn't have one word to say about it because, if you got to pay your debts, just like them fucks from Game of Thrones. A Lannister always pays his debts, but that woman probably wasn't a Lannister, so, 2 Kings 4:1. So no. The Abrahamic God is no better than the society that created him.
There were privileges for Israelites because in Israel it was a theocracy. And so, for example, only Israelites could own land because you had to be a believer in Yahweh to own land in the Holy Land.
Why specify that the person from Israel should not be beaten to mistreated?
Well, actually, they didn't think, if I understand this correctly, and this is not my area of expertise, Leviticus 25, but if I understand this correctly, they didn't want other Israelites to be taken in servitude. They would find another way to forgive the debt, okay? Because there were privileges that Israelite citizens had that people in the country didn't.
Dr. Josh Bowen and I had a lengthy discussion on this topic when we responded to Paul Copan's remarks about slavery. Here's a clip from that live stream.
But most likely here, a foreigner who is, and I would say almost certainly a foreigner that's dwelling in the land, and this is a tenant farmer, right? This is somebody that is not able to own land themselves, right? If you think about the land of Israel is divided up, and the tribes get their portions, and so foreigners, the Hebrew word ger, or nochri or toshav or any of these foreigners, they can't own land, right, in Israel because it's already been apportioned to God's people. So what they can do is they can come in and rent a field from you. So John, let's say you're an Israelite, you own 10 acres of land. I come in, I'm a foreigner, and I say, hey, I'd like to rent out an acre of land to sow and to, cultivate. And I'm going to, with the anticipation that I'm going to yield a substantial crop, and I'll be able to pay you the rent from a portion of it and then make money from the rest, right? So I'm renting out an acre from you. So if I do that, a person that is doing that is called a toshav, right? It's the argument. I think it's pretty compelling, but it's somebody that's residing in the land doesn't own the land. Okay, so when it says here, you may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, it's talking about these toshavim, these toshavs, these tenant farmers that are living in the land. What happens if I default on my loan to you? Well, if I'm an Israelite and I default on my loan, John, you're not allowed as a fellow Israelite to treat me as an eved. You're not allowed to treat me as a slave. So then it says here, As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you, and you may buy them from among the strangers that sojourn with you. So me, the foreigner, the toshav, you can take me as a slave, right? And they may be your property. Now, the question is here, what happens is down in verse 47, if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, that's also the word toshav. The word toshav is used there. And what happens is people look at verse 45, they see the word toshav, and then they look down at verse 47 and they see the word toshav and they say, aha, the toshav in 45 is a slave. That means the toshav in 47 is a slave. Now let's just stop there for a second. When I come into Israel and I rent out, or I rent out a field from you, an acre from you, am I a slave, John?
I technically no. I don't think so.
I'm renting land from you. In fact, I may be independently wealthy. In fact, I think many of them were. I could have an awful lot of money. I just can't own land here, so I'm going to have to rent it out from you. I mean, shit, I might say to you, I'm going to rent all your land, right? I mean, that wouldn't work, but but I rent out a field. When do I become a slave? I am a toshav when I rent out that field and work it. That's who a toshav is.
Mm-hmm.
When do I become a slave? Well, when I default on my loan. But John, what if I don't default on my loan? What if actually I make a shit ton of money? What if I have this amazing like bumper crop or whatever? I mean, I'm not a agricultural guy, so sorry, I don't even, bumper crop might not be the right word there. But what if I make a whole bunch of, get a whole bunch of produce, make a whole bunch of money, and now, I mean, I'm just killing it out here. Mm-hmm. Am I a slave? No, I'm just this tenant farmer, and I'm doing really, really well. Now, if I don't do really well, John, you're allowed, if I default on my loan, you're allowed to take me as a slave. And you don't have to release me at the Jubilee. That's all that text is saying.
Okay.
In verse 47, it says, but if Josh, the toshav, the guy that, came and rented out the field, let's say I don't do what happens in verse 45. I don't actually default on my loan and have to be, sell myself to you and become a permanent slave, a chattel slave. Let's say that doesn't happen. Let's say actually I do really well. And look what I can do. If he becomes rich and your brother, an Israelite, so, let's say you got a brother named Jim or a friend that's an Israelite named Jim, and Jim becomes poor and I give him a loan because that's how wealthy I am. I give him a loan and he, an Israelite, defaults on the loan to me, right? He defaults on the loan that I gave him and I take him as a slave. See, what the text is doing, I probably should have just drawn this, but what the text is doing is the text is dealing essentially with if an Israelite, loses money, if an Israelite or loses land, if he loses all his money, and if he loses all his money and his land and has to sell himself as a slave, then in verse 47, what happens if he has to sell himself as a slave to a foreigner? That's what the text is doing here. So the point is that just because the same Hebrew word is used in 45 and 47, it would be like saying, man, I feel like I'm not being clear. Maybe in the audience, people could tell me if I'm being clear. John, do you think I'm being clear?
I mean, I think you're being clear. I mean, I followed you pretty well. That and maybe I can steel man it for you to see if I'm correct. So basically, Israelites are allowed to buy, chattel slaves from the nations around them, but also if a sojourner in the land, like a foreigner in the land, is like defaults on the loan or whatnot, that person can become a slave to the person that they own money to. But conversely, if they don't default on the loan, then I guess an Israelite can sell themselves into debt slavery to the foreigner.
Yeah, that's right. So option one, like scenario one, that was perfect.
But as Copan points out, any other person in another country around Israel would have fled to Israel and be put under these rules rather than the rules they came from, because they had no rights or fewer rights in these other neighboring countries.
This again is simply not true. In fact, the Israelites had similar laws to other ancient Near East societies that they existed around. And some of these laws from these foreign lands were even more lenient on the slave population than the Israelite laws. For instance, in the laws of Hammurabi, if a debt slave sold himself into the service of another person, they were to be released after 3 years. Whereas in Israelite culture, they were to be released after 6 years of servitude. And there are various portions of the laws of Hammurabi that give slaves certain rights. Like laws 170 to 171 in the laws of Hammurabi actually said that if a slave girl was married to her master, then that slave girl would be released and given freedom upon her master's death, and was even allowed to stay in her master's residence, and perhaps even an equal portion of the master's property after his death. In the last century of the 3rd millennium, slaves were even allowed to conduct their own court cases. They could call witnesses and give testimony. In the New Kingdom in Egypt, slaves could not only give evidence, but could also own their own fields. The laws of Hammurabi also prohibited masters from abusing their slaves or beating them to death or what have you. Another cool thing is that if a slave claimed that the master was not really his master, then they would actually have to resolve that in court. And it wasn't just, the master's word over the slave's word. Legal proceedings had to come into the picture. Also, in the Middle Assyrian palace decrees, we see that slave women servants were protected from their owners or mistresses or whatever from being beaten to death. And they actually have a whole system in place for if the slave needs to be punished in some kind of way. And it doesn't just include, allowing the master to beat the slave relentlessly. There was specific instructions as to how these things were to be carried out, and none of them include beating the slave to death. In fact, if a master beat a slave to death in this particular instance, the master would be held accountable for that death. Claiming that other countries had little to no laws protecting their slave population is ignoring a whole lot of information that we absolutely know about the ancient Near East societies.
So this is a great improvement. The other thing we have to point out, and Copan points this out as well, Robert, is the Old Testament law is not the ideal law for all time.
No.
It is not. It was made for ancient Israel just for that situation. Now, there are principles in it that are universal, like most of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder, commit adultery, these kind of things. But some of the case law and some of this minutia that you get into, not ideal.
Weirdly enough, Exodus 20:17, which is part of the 10 Commandments, actually lists slaves in the property section. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male and female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Like, as fucking property. Women and slaves are listed under property. Exodus 20:17. It's rather funny how this particular part isn't part of Frank's list about the 10 Commandments. I don't know if he started listing them off, and then when in his mind he got to this particular commandment, he's like, I don't know if I should mention this or just stop here. I think stopping here is probably the best thing to do right now. In any case, my question at this point in the apologist spiel is rather simple. Why was an all-powerful God constrained by what his people, his chosen few, would accept. I mean, think about it. God commands the Israelites to do some really pedantic shit. God literally draws a blueprint for the tabernacle and the temple. He lays it all out for them. He's even so specific that he tells them what kind of metal to build all this shit with. He also tells them exactly how gold encrusted his temple chamber should be. God even describes exactly how to build the Ark of the Covenant. God even had 2 of his own priests killed by spontaneous combustion when they used the wrong fire to light the incense after he took a major dump in the temple toilet. I may be taking some liberties with that one. But you're telling me that this pedantic fucking snowflake of a God was not pedantic enough to tell people, hey, don't own another person's property, because people aren't property. That was too much for God? Like, that's the point where God draws the line in the sand. Like, sure, you got to use this kind of fire in order to light my incense, but, you know, that's pretty much where my commandments stop. You can still own people as slaves. Like, that's the line in the sand for God. It's not crossing the line in order to own people as slaves for God. He's okay with that. I really don't think that this argument is the flex that Frank thinks that it is. Personally, I feel that he's essentially painting his own God as endorsing and condoning slavery even more. God cares more about how encrusted you make his temple chamber than he does about owning people as slaves. Just let that sink in.
In fact, Jesus even says it in Matthew chapter 19. Here's what Jesus says about the Old Testament law. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. In other words, he's saying, I wouldn't have permitted divorce as God, but your hearts were so hard that I actually acquiesced. And the same thing is true when it comes to some of these slavery situations, really indentured servitude situations, that God's bringing people along incrementally.
Except God wasn't doing anything incrementally? As we showed before, the laws in Israel were similar to the laws in the wider ancient Near East. God literally wasn't doing anything special. He was basically par for the course as far as ancient slavery goes. Honestly, it just makes it look like a bunch of jackasses copy and pasted laws from the wider Near East and then claimed that God commanded them. That's not incrementally bringing anybody along. That's sticking to the status quo, and even in the New Testament, they still practice chattel slavery. Like, Jesus is fine with chattel slavery. He says, slave, obey your masters. And, you know, while Paul does have some verses that people regularly spout in order to say, oh, well, they didn't like slavery neither. None of those verses actually condemned slavery. Slavery was still fine. If the New Testament actually condemned slavery, then I sincerely doubt that the Atlantic slave trade would have been used to spread Christianity, and Christianity wouldn't have been used to keep the slave population down and enslaved. But let's go back to this whole incremental shit, because as far as incrementally goes, like bringing them along incrementally, why does God have to do this? Can't God just give a commandment and his chosen people are supposed to follow it? Whether or not they actually follow his commandments, because there's several times in the Old Testament where they don't follow it, but then they pay for it later and all this other shit. The ideal situation is that God gives a command, they're supposed to follow it and do it. God narcissistically has 4 commandments in his 10 commandments that stroke his own ego. And those are the first 4 commandments. Honestly, he could have combined all 4 of them sumbitches into one run-on sentence for commandment number 1, and that would have freed up 3 slots for, like, oh, I don't know, don't own other people as slaves, women are equal to men, and hey, don't rape anybody. As the supreme ruler and creator of everything, he could have easily done that. Instead, God was like, oh, just don't make any kind of fucked up images of me, okay? Delete that picture. In fact, just don't make any pictures of me, okay? That's a commandment. Just don't do it, okay? And apparently, that was far more important to God than to telling everybody, hey, let's forego owning people as property. Let's just not do that. Again, this is not the flex that Frank thinks it is.
In fact, you know, there's a parallel to this right now in this country. We've had Roe v. Wade in place for 49 years, illegitimately argued or decided, but it was the law of the land for 49 years.
Oh, no, the abortion debate is not similar to slavery at all. Also, Roe versus Wade was about protecting people's privacy and protecting a person's right to an abortion. I mean, honestly, the government shouldn't be the third party in between a patient and their doctor. I feel like this exposes the fascistic nature of evangelistic Christianity. They actively want a Christian theocracy instead of our current government. Claiming that Roe versus Wade was illegitimately argued means that you don't think that people have a right to privacy? Honestly, I kind of feel like there would be a whole bunch of pastors and priests out there that are like, hold on, with privacy, we definitely deserve some privacy out here. Just don't look at taxes from 1982 on my desktop. I'm just saying, oh, that's right, honey. They think that women don't deserve privacy, but they get all the privacy they want. That kind of exposes how Frank's whole argument here is more of a rules for thee and not for me kind of situation. Another thing to keep in mind here as far as the history of the abortion debate goes, the anti-abortion crowd after Roe versus Wade was decided or handed down was a severe minority in the United States. The only reason why it's become such a central point of political debate now is because of the moral majority. The moral majority was a Christo-fascist organization founded by Jerry Falwell. That fucking dick. That's right, honey. Jerry Falwell did this in order for Christianity, specifically evangelistic Christianity, to influence American politics. And they did this by manipulating the Republican Party into the Christo-fascist group that it is now. After Roe versus Wade was handed down, this moral majority organization pushed the abortion topic to the center stage of national politics. Most of the people then, just like now, supported Roe versus Wade. And I really don't think that Jerry Falwell honestly cared about the topic, other than he saw it as an entry point for Christianity to start influencing American politics. If you want to talk about an incremental change or an incremental influence on people, then you just have to look at the Republicans that we have now and how they've been incrementally changed into Christian fascists.
Now, as soon as it's overturned, notice how abrupt some states, including Vermont, decided to go way in the other direction and say, you can kill your child up to the moment of birth.
That is not what Vermont did. The Vermont Human Rights Act was passed in 2019. This law prohibits public entities from denying or interfering with an individual's right to an abortion. Now, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, Vermont did pass the Vermont Reproductive Liberty Amendment. This was approved by voters in November of 2022, and this amendment enshrines the right to abortion in Vermont's constitution. Vermont is one of the most progressive states on abortion access. They do allow abortion throughout the entire pregnancy, and Frank interprets this as being able to kill a child up until the moment of birth. What Frank isn't telling you is that if a pregnancy requires an abortion at that stage in the pregnancy, it's usually due to extremely rare circumstances. Generally, individuals that are that far into a pregnancy definitely want that child. Additionally, medical professionals also have their own ethical standards and processes that wouldn't allow them to kill a baby at birth or just before birth. This effectively makes the whole they can kill children up until the moment of birth a bullshit statement. Abortion access should be provided throughout the entire pregnancy in order to provide the best care for everyone.
If we're going to get people to adhere to a pro-life position now, we're going to have to bring them along incrementally. We're not going to be able to just say, well, we got to ban all abortions because people are not going to tolerate that. Just like they wouldn't tolerate a complete abolishment of indentured servitude in Old Testament times.
Slavery, not indentured servitude. chattel slavery. Also, reasonable people are never going to incrementally get to the point where all abortion is illegal. It's very important to all people's health that access to abortion be maintained. Also, access to abortion services is necessary for any country. And that's not just me saying it. All of the data points to the positive effects that abortion has on a society. For instance, the number of teenage mothers drops. It reduces poverty. It improves educational outcomes. It provides increased economic security. It also improves mental and physical health. And it can be shown to reduce crime rates. Basically, Frank Turek and his buddies want to regress the United States into a worse situation than we already find ourselves in. He would rather put lives at risk than offend the sensibilities of his snowflake God. He also seems to want to put the wants and needs of ignorant misogynists ahead the health and well-being of every individual.
Let me give you an example of this. In Florida, Ron DeSantis knew that his state wasn't sufficiently pro-life to ban abortion. So what did he do? He said, okay, we're going to ban abortions after 15 weeks. Okay? Now, hopefully he can work further into that and maybe lower that as people become more and more pro-life. But if he had gone in and said, we're going to ban all abortions, he wouldn't get the votes for that. So what is he going to do? He's going to bring people along incrementally.
Just a little bit of a correction here. DeSantis wouldn't have gotten the votes because reasonable people recognize the benefits to abortion access. A majority of Americans, 61%, want to maintain access to abortion services in this country. What Frank is really saying is that he wants to incrementally convince everybody to ignore the data. He wants to incrementally convince everybody that the sensibilities of his God are more important than providing health care to people. Whenever he says bullshit like you just heard, you should think of this.
Yet you see California, Vermont, New York, Massachusetts, some of these states, they're going so far now in the other direction to say, basically, you can't tell us what to do. We're gonna kill children all the way to the second of birth. That's just depraved. How are you going to bring depraved people along? You're going to have to bring them along incrementally, and that's what God does here.
Oh, that's not what any of those states did. Those states enshrined the right to abortion in their state constitutions and protected the rights of their citizens. That's a good thing, and what government should do. Frank needs to portray those states as wanting to kill nearly born babies because that fits his narrative. The narrative that humans are so depraved that they will kill newborn infants and not even bat an eye about it. He doesn't understand the experience of someone seeking or needing an abortion. He simply doesn't care about those people. He doesn't care about the repercussions of limiting access to abortion. Frank Turek only cares about one thing, and that's how his God feels about something. And I'm just now reminded that this video was supposed to be about slavery and Frank's usual watering down of slavery into indentured servitude, all in an effort to protect his God. He's trying to provide damage control for shit that God has said. Well, God is portrayed as saying in the Bible. I don't think that God actually said shit. This is because an all-powerful God allowing and even endorsing slavery to exist is a really bad look. God could have stopped this practice with one simple commandment, but he chose not to. If God had, it really would have set Israel apart from the other ancient Near East societies. It would have been unique. It would have been better, but that's not what his God did. In the Bible, his God keeps the status quo of that area. In the Bible, his God keeps the status quo in the ancient Near East. The Abrahamic God commanded the subjugation of women and also commanded and endorsed taking people as chattel slaves. In the context of ancient people groups, We can understand this because we understand that they didn't have the best societal norms or the best ideas on human rights. We can recognize that. But in the context of an all-powerful ruler and creator of everything, this just simply doesn't make sense. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I really appreciate you guys watching this video. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Frank Turek's watering down of chattel slavery. What do you think about him comparing slavery to the abortion debate? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.